Margaret Hayes had spent 28 years building a life. 28 years of early mornings packing lunches, late nights waiting up, and countless moments in between filled with the kind of love that asks for nothing in return. Her son, Michael, had been her entire world after his father passed when the boy was only 7. She worked 2 jobs to put him through college. She celebrated every achievement as if it were her own. And when Michael married Rebecca, a woman with ambition in her eyes and calculation in her smile, Margaret welcomed her with open arms. She wanted her son to be happy. That was all that ever mattered. The house on Maple Street wasn't much, but it was hers. A modest 2-story with blue shutters and a garden she'd tended for decades. Every rose bush, every stone in the walkway held a memory. This was where Michael took his first steps, where she'd read him bedtime stories, where they'd laughed and cried and grown together when the illness came. It came suddenly. One moment Margaret was pruning her roses, the next she was in an ambulance, sirens wailing, world spinning. The doctors used words like critical and touch and go. For 26 days, she lay in that hospital bed, floating between consciousness and dreams, fighting her way back to the life she wasn't ready to leave. Michael visited, of course. He held her hand and spoke words of encouragement. But Rebecca came less frequently, and when she did, there was something in her expression Margaret couldn't quite place. Something cold beneath the concerned smile. When Margaret finally came home, weak but grateful to be alive, she found her key no longer worked. She stood on her own porch, confused, trying the lock again and again. The door opened, but it wasn't Michael who greeted her. It was Rebecca, arms crossed, face set in stone. "What are you doing here?" Rebecca's voice was flat, unwelcoming. I live here. This is my home." "Not anymore." Rebecca's words cut through the autumn air like ice. "Michael transferred the deed while you were sick. This house belongs to us now. You can't come in." Margaret felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "Where's Michael? I need to speak to my son." Michael appeared behind his wife, and the look on his face told Margaret everything. Guilt mixed with determination, weakness masquerading as strength. "Mom, Rebecca's right. We need this space. We're starting a family. You understand, but where will I go?" Rebecca handed her a small bag. "Your clothes are in here. There's a women's shelter on 5th Street. Or maybe one of your friends can take you in." Margaret stood there, holding that bag, staring at the son she'd sacrificed everything for. The son who couldn't meet her eyes. She wanted to scream, to cry, to demand justice. Instead, she simply nodded. "I see," she whispered. "I see who you've become." She turned and walked away from the house on Maple Street, each step heavier than the last. Behind her, the door closed. She didn't look back. Margaret stayed with her friend Doris for a week, sleeping on a worn couch, crying into her coffee, trying to understand how love could be repaid with such cruelty. But Margaret Hayes hadn't survived 63 years by breaking easily. She'd been knocked down before. She knew how to get back up. She found a small apartment across town. She picked up extra shifts at the diner where she'd worked part-time for years, and she started planning. Not from anger, though she felt plenty of that. Not from hatred, though betrayal burned in her chest. She planned from a place of clarity, of understanding that some lessons can only be taught through experience. 3 months passed. Margaret saved every penny, lived simply, and waited. She knew Michael and Rebecca, knew their weaknesses, their pride, their greed. She knew that what came easily would be taken for granted, and what was taken for granted would eventually be lost. Then she made her move. The foreclosure notice came first. Margaret had never transferred the mortgage, and without her signature forged, documents wouldn't hold up in court. The bank wanted its money. Money that Michael and Rebecca, living beyond their means in Margaret's house, didn't have. The lawsuit came next. Margaret's lawyer, working pro bono after hearing her story, filed suit for fraud and elder abuse. The case was airtight, the evidence clear. The deed transfer had been illegal, signed when Margaret was sedated and unconscious. Margaret stood in that courtroom, facing her son for the first time since he'd turned her away. She saw him there, looking smaller somehow, next to Rebecca, who wore her anger like armor. The judge listened to both sides, reviewed the evidence, and delivered a verdict that surprised no one who knew the truth. The house would be returned to Margaret. Michael and Rebecca would face fines and criminal charges for fraud, and Margaret would have the choice to press further charges or show mercy. She chose mercy, not because they deserved it, but because she was better than her pain.as. Michael and Rebecca left the courtroom. Margaret called out to her son one last time. Michael! He turned, and she saw tears in his eyes. Real ones, maybe. Or maybe just tears of self-pity. I forgave you the moment you closed the door, Margaret said quietly. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean pretending this didn't happen. You made your choice. Now you live with it. You gave away more than a house, Margaret continued, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. You gave away trust. You gave away integrity. You gave away the one person who loved you unconditionally. That's a price that will cost you far more than any judge could ever impose. Margaret returned to her house on Maple Street. She changed the locks, planted new roses, and slowly began to heal. Some days were harder than others. Some nights she still cried for the son she'd raised, wondering where she'd gone wrong, knowing deep down she probably hadn't. Michael called once, 6 months later. Margaret let it go to voicemail. She listened to his voice, breaking and desperate, asking for another chance. She saved the message but didn't call back. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Some bridges, once burned, leave ashes too deep to build upon again. What Margaret learned, sitting in her garden with tea growing cold in her hands, was that kindness without boundaries is not kindness at all. That love without respect is merely obligation. And that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go, even when it breaks your heart to do it. She'd given Michael life. She'd given him everything she had, but she couldn't give him character. That he would have to find on his own. And as for Margaret, she lived, she breathed. She found joy in small things: morning coffee, sunset walks, friends who loved her truly. She discovered that starting over at 63 wasn't an ending but a beginning. A chance to live for herself, finally, after a lifetime of living for others. The house on Maple Street stood strong, its blue shutters bright against the sky, its garden blooming with roses of every color. And inside, Margaret Hayes built a new life from the ashes of the old one. A life that was smaller, perhaps, but entirely her own. Sometimes, late at night, she thought about Michael, wondered if he'd learned anything, hoped, despite everything, that he'd find his way back to the person she'd raised him to be. But she didn't wait for him anymore. She'd done enough waiting. Margaret had learned the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes the people we love most are the ones who hurt us deepest. And sometimes the greatest victory isn't revenge. It's surviving. It's moving forward. It's choosing, despite everything, to keep your heart open to the world, even after it's been broken by those who were supposed to protect it. The house on Maple Street witnessed it all. The love, the betrayal, the heartbreak, and the healing. And if houses could speak, it would tell you this, that Margaret Hayes was stronger than any storm, braver than any fear, and worthy of far more than she'd been given. She was still standing, and that, in the end, was everything.